So, good afternoon, everybody. Again, good morning, still before noon. So, I will continue on the lecture about changes in demographic indicators and general trends in the US. We were talking about family composition here in the last class. My screen is not working, so you also have to look at the big screen here. This continuing on this overview of demographic indicators in the US, one major thing that we have been observing, and that's true for other developed countries, but also to developing countries, is improvement in mortality. So improvement in mortality, it means that mortality declines and people live longer, right? So we have been seeing that crude death rate has been declining in the US in these last decades. In this case here, we just get the number of people that died in a specific year in the US divided by the number of people in that specific year and multiplied by 1,000. So the crude death rate is just showing that, for example, in 2013, out of 1,000 people that were in the US in that year, 8 people died throughout that year. And exactly because of these declines in crude death rates, we have an improvement in life expectancy at birth. So as I mentioned, like in the chapter about mortality, we will learn how to get mortality rates by age group and estimate life expectancy at birth. And in this case, we have been seeing since the 40s, for example, that life expectancy has been increasing from 60.8, for example, 1940, to 76 among men, and 65 to 81 among women. So overall, mortality improving, which means that people live longer. And for all these years, we see that on average, women live longer than men. Mortality rates lower for women, as we have been talking throughout the course. But what's interesting, this is a more recent figure that I just got last year from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, showing that, yeah, we have been seeing over time in the US improvements in life expectancy at birth. The light green here shows the total life expectancy, and female life expectancy at birth higher than among men. So for example, this is 2019 here, right? I cannot see, yeah, I think it's 2019. The life expectancy at birth in the US as a whole was 78.8, which means that if we get the mortality rates by age group that were measured in the US back in 2019, and we expose a hypothetical group of people to those mortality rates throughout all their lives, they would live on average 78.8 years. And that's 81.4 for women and 76.3 for men. And we had seen through time that life expectancy at birth was increasing. But exactly now, during the pandemic, life expectancy at birth declined from 2019 to 2020. So declining from 78.8 to 77.3. Remember when I showed you the trends in life expectancy at birth for several countries, as it was estimated by the researcher from the Max Planck Institute in Demography from Germany, and showing that after the pandemic, life expectancy at birth declined from 2019 to 2020 and 2020 to 2021. And in that graph, he was showing the results in months, right? So around like how many months on average of life related to life expectancy at birth these countries decline because of the pandemic, or related to the pandemic, because he's measuring exactly the time that the pandemic is happening. And for the US, he measured that from 2019 to 2020, life expectancy at birth declined by 24 months, so 2 years. And here we have 1.5 from the CDC. So these estimates, they might get different results, but overall, they're all showing life expectancy dropping, which is not what we have been experiencing all these previous decades, since 1940, as we saw in the previous table. So life expectancy dropping by these estimates from the CDC by 1.5 years on average, and from the Max Planck Institute by 2 years, right? So something in between that, life expectancy decline, and that's a huge decline, right? Why is it a huge decline? 1.5 or 2 years. If you just go back to that lecture, you're talking about world population change over time. Let's just go back to that graph. The improvements in life expectancy at birth that we were experiencing these last years, they were not so pronounced because it was improving, but not as much. So this is exactly what I was telling you. Between 2019 and 2020, according to estimates from Jonas Scholle, life expectancy in the US dropped by 24 months, 2 years, right? And by an additional 2.3 months between 2020 and 2021. And you see, this number here is how much life expectancy had improved every year between 2016 and 2019. So this number here for the US right here is 1.1. So between 2016 and 2019, the US was improving the life expectancy at birth by around 1.1 months per year. And exactly in 1 year only, it dropped by 24 months, 2 years. And that's exactly what we see in these other estimates from the CDC. So the life expectancy, it is improving over time. It is improving, but by not substantial amount, exactly because it's already so high. When we are in a high level, it's harder to improve. Countries that have lower life expectancy, their jump, their improvement is faster or steeper. But we see that this improvement here is smaller than the decline that we experienced exactly between 2019 and 2020. It's much steeper, the drop from 19 to 20 compared to this improvement from 2000 to 2019. So that's a huge impact if you compare to historical trends. Okay, maximize here again. And then just from the same report from the CDC, they provide this information about changes in life expectancy from 2019 and 20. So it's only for these 2 years here in this graph, but broken down by these race ethnicity groups. Hispanic population, non-Hispanic white, and non-Hispanic black. And then you see the drops. And then you see that the pandemic is affecting in a stronger degree specific race ethnicity groups. Hispanic population dropping from 81 to 78. Non-Hispanic white, 78 to 77. Non-Hispanic black, 74 to 71. So dropping here by almost 3 years on average, life expectancy at birth. The same thing here, 3 years. For non-Hispanic white, only 1 year. 1 year non-Hispanic white, and for the other groups, 3 years. So showing that access to health services and how the pandemic is being dealt by specific race ethnicity groups make them more vulnerable to that, exactly because they don't have access to good health insurance, to good services. They have a lower socioeconomic status, and that affect more their health, right? So that shows that a pandemic like this is important to understand how it also affects different groups because they're more vulnerable to this kind of situation. Another graph from the same one. This is the change in life expectancy at birth between 2019 and 20. And now breaking it down by race, ethnicity, and sex, right? So by race, ethnicity, and sex. So we have Hispanic men and women, no Hispanic Black men and women, no Hispanic white men and women. And just putting these groups in order. And you see that the ones that experience the highest, the steepest drop in life expectancy at birth were Hispanic male, 3.7 years on average between 2019 and 20. And really related to the pandemic, 3.3 among non-Hispanic Black men, and only, or still 1.1 years. It's a big drop if you think how much we're improving these last years among non-Hispanic white women. But you see these discrepancies across different subgroups of the population. This other group, the contribution of leading causes of death to the change in life expectancy between 19 and 20. And here, that's where we start to see a more clear association of deaths caused by COVID-19 and the decline in life expectancy at birth. So deaths caused because of COVID-19 contributed to almost 74% of the overall decline in life expectancy in the US between 2019 and 20. These other diseases here, or these other causes of death, they also had negative impacts on, or they also made life expectancy decline in the period. And in these other ones here, exactly because we had improvements, fewer people dying because of these causes of death in the period compared to before, you actually have a positive association. But you see 74% of the decline that we observe here from 2019 to 20, 74% of this decline here of 1.5 years is related to deaths caused by COVID-19, okay? And these graphs, I got them, I mean, the report, the link, I put it here in PDF, and is this report here. You can take a look at it. It's from the CDC. And so this graph I showed in the PowerPoint. There's some more tables there. This one on the top, I also showed it. This other one I did not, so you can take a look at them. And this one broken down by race, ethnicity, and sex, I also showed it there, okay? This one at the top is cause of death, total, men, women. I showed the one on the top. And this one is Hispanic, non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic Black. But always you see a huge impact due to deaths caused by COVID-19. Cool? So that's material that I got from this report from the CDC. And now we go into those 5 overall trends in demographic indicators that we have observed in the US in these last decades compared to other countries, and also looking at the US by itself. So what we saw in the first part is that fertility is declining, so that's associated with changes in age-sex structure in the US. So the age-sex structure of the country has like fewer people in the base of the pyramid, on the structure and more people in the top. So it stops being more having a pyramid shape into having more rectangular shape. Families are composed in another way. Now you have a higher percentage of families in the US in which both in the couple, they are working outside of the household. And more recent trends show that, okay, mortality has been improving over time, but we cannot always think that mortality will just improve and life expectancy will increase forever. We experience a moment now that the pandemic causes a dip in life expectancy. And these other 5 points, the first one is the one that makes discussion about the fact that the US, among the developed countries, is the one that has the highest levels of fertility, the highest levels of total fertility rate among developed countries. So in this example here, showing data from 1980 to 2006, compare the US with France, Sweden, Germany, Italy, and Czech Republic, we see that the US has much higher total fertility rate than, for example, France, Sweden, and Germany, right? And Italy, what we see is that they have really low levels of total fertility rate, has been improving in these last years and kind of like in the same level as Germany. And it's really related to the fact that women, they don't have the support from the government to have children, and then they start having fewer children because it's expensive, there is no free daycare or anything, and that affects total fertility rate. And they want to invest on their career and their education and getting a good job. They postpone the age in which they get married, they postpone the age in which they have children, and they have fewer children overall. In France, a little higher levels of total fertility rate, and in the US, the highest one. And what demographers have been investigating and finding is that we have a lot of discrepancy in terms of fertility rates among race ethnicity groups and also by nativity. So usually foreign-born population have higher levels of fertility than US-born population. So immigrants usually have more children than people born in the US. But also the American society itself, because of various religious groups tend to be more conservative, and conservative groups usually emphasize larger family, that also influences higher levels of fertility in the country overall, right? The Czech Republic is interesting. That's exactly after the fall of the communist regime around like 1989, you start to see a huge drop in total fertility rate. The fall of the communist societies in East Europe kind of changed the whole structure of their economy. Unemployment increased, you didn't have the support of the government anymore. That created a lot of challenges to people to have children, and that has an effect on fertility declining, okay? And these variations in Sweden, when I taught this class before, one student asked, why does it bounce so much? It increases in the 80s, and then the early 90s, it declines, and then in the early 2000s, it starts to increase again. And I tried to find some articles about it. And what demographers there are showing is exactly related to economic development in the country. Whenever we experience some hardship in terms of economics, and so increasing unemployment of the population, or some sort of impact on the earnings of the population, that affects how many children people will have. So whenever you have some sort of economic crisis or some hardship in the country, fertility declines. And then when you start to have more economic development, fertility increases again. But still, the levels of Sweden lower than the US, okay? So this is just a picture to show that total fertility rate in the US, it's higher overall than in other developed countries. And if you compare to France, Sweden, and Germany, that's really clear. In Italy as well. I mentioned already before that the US is passing through a change in terms of the composition of the population by race ethnicity, right? So now we have a more diverse society, you have like a lot of immigrants coming from Latin America, but also increasing from Asia, also increasing from Africa in recent years as well. And that's making the overall proportion of people who are not non-Hispanic white increase a lot in the country. So if we get all these groups that are not non-Hispanic white, put them all together, and compared to the size of the non-Hispanic white population in the US, they will become more than 50% in this coming decades, so around 2044. And the exact number, the exact year, we don't know for sure, because these are all based on projections, and projections is an approximation, and different studies might have different years, but overall what you see is an increase in diversity in the country, and then less than half of the country will be non-Hispanic white in this next decades. And that, as I emphasized already before, this term, majority-minority society, is kind of, it is controversial because you're just putting together in one group all people who are not non-Hispanic white compared to the size of the group that's non-Hispanic white. But this group here is really heterogeneous within itself, right? And so there are people from different race ethnicity groups. There are people from different, some of them are US born, some of them are born outside of the US. So there is a lot of variation there. So this is really a simplification about it. What I usually, whenever I'm doing this analysis, I don't use that much this term of majority-minority society. I just try to explain, right? I try to explain that overall, the percentage of the non-Hispanic white population has been declining in the country in these last decades, and they will be less than 50% of the population, but the other groups are really different among themselves. Their experience in the American society really varies a lot because they have different social, economic status, they have different educational attainment levels, and so on, right? But here, overall, we have the percentage distribution of the US population by race ethnicity. In 2014, the upper bar, and the 2060, the darker purple bar. And you see the projections, the non-Hispanic white population expected to drop from 62% to 44% in the period. The Black population around the same level, 12, 13. The American Indian, Alaska Natives, around 0.7, 0.6%. Asian population increasing, 5.2, 9.1. Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander also around the same. 2 or more races increasing from 2 to 4.9. So you start to see also intermarriage of marriage of people from different race ethnicity groups, and then the coming generations will self-classify as having 2 or more races. And the Hispanic population increasing from 17 to almost 29% in the period. And if we get all these groups here, from Black to Hispanic, and add them all together, they will increase from 37% to 56% in the period, so they will be more than half of the country. of the more than half of the population in the country. But like I said, these groups here experience really different life conditions in the country. They have different acceptance in the society. They have different socioeconomic status. They have different education levels and so on. For example, in a recent paper that I published with another professor from the sociology department, Dr. Sakamoto, within African Americans in the US, we focused on Nigerian Americans. We focus on people who were born in the US, but their parents, or at least one of their parents, were born in Nigeria. And what we saw is that within that group, within African Americans, their levels of earnings and their levels of education attainment, it's really high and actually reaches the same level as the non-Hispanic white population and the non-Hispanic Asian population. And the whole discussion behind that group is that they are more recent immigrants. They're second generation, right? They are born in the US, but one of their parents is born outside, in this specific case in Nigeria. And that specific group, usually these immigrants that come from Nigeria in more recent years, they are positively self-selected in the sense that usually people who have already higher earnings and high education levels, they are moving from Nigeria to the US. And in Nigeria, they speak English. So there is not the issue of learning English because they already know it. So getting jobs here, it's easier for them compared to other groups. But also because of education and earnings. They already come with higher education and earnings, and then their children who are born here tend to have also higher earnings and higher education compared to other groups. So this is just one example to say that these groups here are really different among themselves. And even within these groups, there are differences, right? And when we talk about this, putting together all these groups and call them minority, we are ignoring a lot of difference among themselves. Well, that I want to emphasize over and over. The states that are now majority minority, as it's discussed in the textbook, California, Hawaii, New Mexico, Texas, Nevada, and also DC. 8 other states that are now between 40 and 49% minorities, so almost there. And they will probably become majority. They are probably already majority minority by now, because this data here based on discussion from the textbook. But just to give an idea, because this is data from 2016, right? Showing that, for example, in Hawaii, DC, California, New Mexico, Texas, and Nevada, the percentage of the non-Hispanic white population is below 50%. And these other states, almost below 50%, okay? Texas is already a majority minority state. The non-Hispanic white population dropped below 50% in 2004. And in Texas itself, because of the proximity with the southern border, a lot of immigration from Latin America and so on, and higher levels of fertility among the Hispanic population, Texas will become a majority Hispanic state now somewhere between 2020 and 2030. So the state of Texas will have at least 50% of the population Hispanic itself, not even adding the other groups. So just to emphasize that Texas is a really diverse state, and that's really clear from the trends that we see in the composition of race ethnicity in the state. This is the projected population by race ethnicity in Texas. The non-Hispanic white population in blue, non-Hispanic black in yellow, Hispanic in green, and other groups in red. And then you see the percentage of the Hispanic population increasing over time and reaching 53% by 2030 and 59% by 2040, right? According to these projections. And the overall percentage of the non-Hispanic white population expected to decline from 53% in 2000 to 24% in 2040. And here are some projections of the race ethnicity composition in Texas counties. So we go within Texas and look at the race ethnicity composition, kind of simplify it, putting in blue the counties that have at least 50% of the population in non-Hispanic white, and the areas in white, they have less than 50% of the population non-Hispanic white. So in 2000, most of the counties, they had more than 50% of the population self-classified as white. Whenever I'm talking here, white is non-Hispanic white. And some different scenarios for 2040. And then we see a story in which we see many more counties with at least, or let's say less than 50% of the population being white. And less than 50% white, here is counterintuitive, is exactly the white areas, the white counties. But just when you compare to the map in 2000 and the projection to 2040, even using different scenarios for fertility of the population, we see an increase in the number of counties that have less than 50% of white population, right? And we, of course, we experienced that first in areas closer to the southern border because of the proximity to Mexico and to Latin America. And then I'm not saying that they are crossing through the border, but those are areas that have higher percentage. And this is not related to it's not related to nativity. It's not related to whether they were born in the US or not. This is information about race ethnicity. So here could be children of immigrants, right? Second generation, third generation, and already born in the US, but who don't classify themselves as white, okay? The third topic here about overall specificities in demography in the US. There has been changes in the origin of undocumented immigrants in the US in these last centuries and decades. Until now, Mexico has supplied the United States with immigrant workers to fill low-wage jobs. But what we have seen in more recent decades is an unprecedented decline in Mexican immigration. So in the pandemic now, I mean, I'm doing this specific study about how the pandemic is affecting the restaurant industry. Who are the workers in the restaurant industry? Did the pandemic affect more the workers who are foreign born or US born, right? And usually foreign born people, when they work in the restaurant industry, they work more in the back of the house. US born, they tend to work more in front of the house, waiters and so on. But we are trying to understand whether because of the pandemic, because of the decline in international immigration, because of all the measures that were implemented trying to prevent people from crossing the border, because of the pandemic, because of the public health issues, that even made it stronger, the decline in immigration from Mexico and from Latin America overall. So this discussion here is already done in the textbook from 2017. And right around that's when we had the previous administration, the previous federal administration, at least with the discourse against immigration, right? And now in 2020, 2021, the pandemic. So all these factors that we saw before, that we saw with the previous federal administration, and now because of the pandemic, might have even further negative impacts on the number of undocumented immigrants entering the country, right? More because of these overall changes before, and some demographers, Douglas Massey, for example, he's one of the most well-known demographers that does studies about international migration, a professor from Princeton University, and has been studying whether this decline in undocumented immigrants coming to the US is related to better economic conditions in Mexico. Of course, I'm talking about all before pandemic, right? Better economic conditions in Mexico, so people stay there instead of coming. And also because now, at this point, Mexico is also passing through the demographic dividend as Brazil, as those graphs that I showed you before. Really low percentage of the population in working ages, lower percentage of the population in working ages, a higher percentage of the population in working ages that generates more economic development in the country. That could create some competition for jobs, but exactly because now we have more people in working ages in Mexico and other Latin American countries, that it's a positive effect of demography on economics that generates economic development if the overall conditions are in place. And then these people don't have to get out of their countries, right? So there are these different studies trying to emphasize whether demographic composition influenced the decline in undocumented immigrants coming to the US, and whether it's overall economic development that we see, right? Economic development and demographic composition. But then, because of immigration policies being implemented, and because of the pandemic that restricted a lot the movement of people across borders, that might have even further effects. And one of the major discussions that Poston does, the author of the textbook, and he wrote different op-eds about that as well, and the one in the bottom here is one of them, the link in the bottom of the slide. He's emphasizing that these last years, we have seen a decline in the number of undocumented immigrants coming to the US from Mexico and from Latin America overall. And we have seen that there is an increase in Asian workers coming to the US, more specifically Chinese workers. So this new influx of immigrant workers who will be fleeing hopeless conditions in China, they might replace these previous workers with lower levels of education, lower levels of job skills in the labor market. So one of his main hypotheses for these next decades is that these Chinese workers might replace the previous undocumented immigrants in the labor market, right? So there is a lot of stuff going on there, right? Whenever you're talking about immigration, we have to think about what's going on in the sending countries and also what's going on in the receiving countries in the US. The sending countries passing through economic development, they don't have to get out. They have a demographic composition now that you have more people working, and that's good for the country. They don't have to get out. You start to see fewer Latin Americans coming here overall. And this discourse from the media that there are all these caravans of immigrants coming on, this is just the media, just for highlights. Actual data shows that the number of undocumented immigrants has been declining, right? And we're going to talk about this throughout the whole course. And that's one thing that I hope that you guys will see from the data, that a lot of this discourse against immigration is just not based on science, right? It's not based on real data. And then you see an increase in Asian immigrants coming to the US. In the US, we still need people working in jobs that pay less, that it's for people that have lower levels of education. That's bad, but the economy needs that. And that's the discussion that Dudley Poston makes, that Chinese workers might replace those previous undocumented workers, right? And here's just to show immigrants. These are foreign-born people, people born outside of the US, from Mexico, from China, and from India. They're born outside of the US, and for each one of these years, from 2000 to 2013, from the American Community Survey, there is one question. In addition to where you were born, there is another question. Where were you 1 year ago? So this graph here is not showing the overall stock, the overall amount of immigrants from Mexico, India, and China in the US. It's showing out of those people that were born in Mexico, India, and China, how many of them entered the US in the last year? In the last year, how many of them entered the country? In thousands, the vertical axis. So for 2000, for these guys here, these are people from India, from China, and from Mexico who entered the US between 1999 and 2000. These people here are people who entered the US from China, India, and Mexico between 2012 and 2013. So this analysis is based on two questions. Where were you born? And where were you living in your home country in the last year, right? And then what we see, that overall number of immigrants entering the country from Mexico in these last years has been declining a lot, right? And from India and China has been increasing. And what you see is that China, in overall numbers, the flow of immigrants from China to the US is now bigger in absolute terms than the flow of immigrants from Mexico to the US. The flow. Flow is the number of immigrants entering the country in each one of the years. But of course, Mexico has been sending immigrants to the US for several years in higher levels than China was. As we see, even in this graph here, for numbers, for example, before 2010. So if you look at the stock, the overall number of immigrants in the US who are from Mexico, it's higher than the ones that are from China, the stock, the overall amount. The flow per year, it's now higher from China than from Mexico, right? Of course, these numbers bounce around. This is data from 2013. So much stuff going on, presidents being elected, and then we also see the pandemic. So all these numbers deserve more attention for the upcoming American Community Surveys. The latest American Community Survey available is the 2019. The 2020 American Community Survey has some issues of declines in sample size exactly because of the pandemic. So it has not been completely released, but the full ACS, the latest one is from 2019. So we can do this same kind of estimation here, also up to 2019 for every year between 14 and 19. Another topic that's emphasized in the chapter is the increase in ages in which people get married for the first time, right? So between 1890 and 2014, there has been a lot of variation in the ages in which people get married. So overall, between 1890 and until 1950, people start to actually get married at younger ages, right? So the ages in which people get married for the first time decline. So people were getting married at younger ages. That's because the country starts to experience economic development, and then people have better conditions, start to form families, get married even at younger ages, and then have children and so on, right? But starting on the 50s, what do you see? Then it's more expensive to have children. Like urbanization starts to increase further and further. It's expensive to have children. And also women start to invest on their education, invest on their professional career. And then people start to postpone the age in which they get married. People start to get married at older ages, right? Both for men and women, the ages in which people get married start to increase in more recent years, usually around between the 1950s and 1960s. So the graph is first showing a trend over time, declines, people getting married earlier up to 1950, and then after that, people start to postpone the age in which they get married. They start to get married older. Another thing that you see, on average, men get married older, right? Men get married older compared to women, usually because older men on average, they marry younger women, right? So we have this difference in the couples within couples that cause this difference across time by sex. Differences in ages at first marriage by year, decline and then increase. Differences in age at first marriage by sex. Men getting married older than women on average. What do we see here in addition to that in this graph? We see that the differentials between men and women in the ages of getting married, they are getting narrower. This difference here is not so high as we saw in previous centuries, in previous decades, right? Exactly now, you have couples maybe closer in age, but also because both men and women are investing in their education. Both of them are investing in their professional careers before getting married. And as women start to go to have a college degree and then go into the labor market, they postpone the ages in which they get married. That starts to increase again. And it's getting closer and closer to the average age at first marriage of men. Okay? Cool. Fifth point, decrease in percentages of persons marrying. The overall percentage of people getting married has been declining. And for this specific graph, you're just focusing on women with at least 15 years of age, right? The percentage of those married has been declining. The percentage of those never married has been increasing over time. The percentage of those divorced increasing a little bit. And the percentage of those widowed declining over time. And probably the percentage of those widowed declining over time because maybe now with improvements in mortality for men, they living longer, then you start to see more men and women dying around the same ages. And then the percentage of women who are widowed decline in these more recent years, more recent decades, right? And the percentage divorced increasing over time. And the never married is the one that you really see this huge increase and really related to more cultural changes, socioeconomic changes going on in the country as we have been talking, people focusing on their education, training, and on their professional careers, right? This is a graph from the CDC, kind of like showing the trends in marriage and divorce from, I think, from 1865 until 2010. And these are the rates per 1,000 people, marriage in blue and divorce in orange. And we see that after World War I ends, you see little increase in the percentage of people getting married. And then as you see economic recession, more specific, the Great Depression in the 1930s, that make people postpone the age in which they get married or postponing get married at all. And the overall percentage of people getting married declines. And up until the end of World War II, proportion of people getting married increases, and then it starts to decline again. In the 50s, the mid 50s gets the lowest levels, increases around the 70s, and now declining again. And declining exactly, I mean, I think that's a positive thing in the sense that people are overall, not that they're not getting married at all, it's more that they're postponing marriage, right, to invest in their education and their careers. Whenever we talk about marriage and divorce, a lot of discussion, like moral discussions, come out. But one thing that we see here from this figure, say, oh, the people now don't care about family. People now are getting divorced at really high levels. I see everybody getting divorced around me, in my hometown, in places where I hang out and so on. But if you look at the rates from this graph, you see that the rates of people getting divorced, they actually follow the same trends as the people getting married, right? As the level as the rate of people getting married increases here, you also see proportion of people getting divorced. And then it declines, increases. And then in more recent years, the proportion of people getting married declines, and the overall proportion of people getting divorced decline. Right? It's not that now we have a society that doesn't care about family, doesn't care about old cultural habits, moral tradition, and so on. It's just because what's the denominator of people who can get divorced, right? The people who can get divorced are only people who are married. The denominator, the people who are exposed to the chance of getting divorced, my numerator, are only married people. So the trend in married people influences the trend in divorce. So now that you see a decline in divorce, in marriage, the blue line, you see a decline in divorce as well. Exactly because the population that's exposed to the chance of experiencing a divorce are the married people, denominator of the formula. The married people are exposed to the chance of coming to the numerator if they get divorced, right? All the discussion that we had since the beginning of this course about how rates are calculated, we just have to think about how rates are calculated. What's the denominator of the rate? It's the people who are exposed to the chance of experience what's being measured in the numerator. If the numerator is divorced, the denominator is married people. So it's not about morals or anything. It's just about the trends in marriage influence the trends in divorce, okay? But then you could argue that people now are getting married lower levels in terms of rate per 1,000 people, exactly because you have more gender equality in the country, and then women pursuing education and invest in their career, and that makes percentage of those marrying decline, okay? I said there was 5 points, is more than that, sorry about that. So 6, increasing levels of cohabitation. And that's kind of like correlated with the declining percentage of people getting married. It's related to the fact that now people experience higher levels of cohabitation. People live with their partners even before being formally married. Again, in this graph here, just focusing on women, and more specifically, for those between 19 and 44 years of age. And in order to kind of like understand the trends of a group that's more homogeneous within itself, just getting women who cohabited prior to their first marriage. So these are actually women who are married now, and how many of them cohabited before getting married by the time of the survey here. From the survey was implemented around 2010. But the graph in the horizontal axis is showing the marriage cohort, when people got married, which year people got married, and whether they cohabited before they got married in that year. And we see that for people who got married back in the 60s, 70s, the proportion of those that experienced cohabitation before was much lower than what we see more recently. People who got married in 2000 to 2004 and 2005 to 2009, almost 70% of them had cohabited before getting married. So cohabitation becomes more acceptable in our society, in the US society, right? And then you see this increase over time, in which in more recent years, 70% of those women married, they experienced cohabitation before. And then increasing percentage of births to unwed women. So also the levels of the percentage of women who have children when they are not formally married has been increasing over time. So to be more specific, here we have the percentage of births to unmarried women by race and Hispanic origin from 1955 to 2013. The overall trend going from 5.3% to around 41%. So this is the percentage of births that were given by women who are not married. So out of 100 births in 2013, 40% of those births were given by women who were not married, who were unmarried, right? And the same trends that I said about the life expectancy, like when you go from really low levels and then you start to increase, the increase tends to be steeper, faster. And then when you reach high levels, it starts to maybe increase or decrease, but in lower levels. That's exactly what you see here, right? Much steeper curve here. And then around mid-90s, start to see a little bit increases, but a little bit more constant. And then big increase here in the mid-2000s, and now more constant around 41%. So again, in 2013, out of all the births being given in the US in that year, 41% were given by women who were not married. And then you see differences by race ethnicity. The percentage of births among African-American women who were given by African-American women who were not married, almost 72%. Hispanic, 53%, and non-Hispanic white, 30%, right? And a lot of demographers that study family composition and so on usually point out that households in which the couple is formally married, usually they have a better structure, a better socioeconomic status. And it's not by saying that because these women they are having kids when they are not married, they are going to have lower socioeconomic status. It's not a causality analysis. It's the overall analysis of all these factors associated with each other, correlated with each other. It's not causation. But one important thing that we're going to discuss further in the course is that a lot of these women here, African-American women who are having their children and they are not married, so 71% of the births out of these women are women who are not married, a lot of them actually might have a partner living with them at home. They're just not formally married, they're just cohabiting, right? So there is still the partner living at home and in some way contributing to the family, right? So we just have to understand the details, the nuances of these indicators. Cool? How old are the unmarried women who had babies? And here in the horizontal axis, we get the age of women when they have births, and that's data only from 2013. So here we see percentage of all births to a married woman by age of mother. So out of women who are under 15 years of age, how many of the births out of those women were women who were not married? 99%. Out of the women who are at least 40 years old, out of the births of this woman who are at least 40 years old, what's the percentage of those births that are from women who are not married? Around 24%. All right, so there's a huge difference here. Usually younger women who don't have still a stable life in terms of economic prospects and even education. The ones who get married are usually, the ones who have births, the ones who have children are usually not married, 99%, 88% for those between 15 and 19. And that brings a lot of challenges, right? So they're still in school and they're having children. They're not formally married. Are they still living with their parents? Or are they cohabiting with their partner? Or are they living by themselves? All that creates challenges to their life. Having children in younger ages like that and don't having the support will affect their socioeconomic prospects and health to the future. That's the concern of demographers here, okay? So these are just the references here. So we discuss in this chapter the overall changes in population in the US in recent years, recent decades, and these major demographic topics in the US, the 7 topics that we saw just now, okay? And now we go to the next chapter about theories of demography. So I just, so the outline of this chapter here, just give you some introduction to what is theory, what is hypothesis, just emphasize that again to you guys. Discuss some early writings about population. And these early writings about population, they helped us understand declines in mortality, declines in fertility, and how population increased over time. And these early writings then help us create this overall explanation about the declines in mortality and fertility, which you saw from that figure about the demographic transition theory. So we're going to talk about the demographic transition theory again, and going a little bit more in depth as we discuss in the chapter about world population changes over time. The demographic transition theory is this overall explanation about why populations have been declining mortality, followed by declines in fertility, and how that affects population size. But why exactly fertility declines? Why exactly mortality declines? Then we have specific studies that try to explain that. And we're going to talk about fertility theories, talk about health and mortality transition, and the demographic theory of mortality, why mortality has been declining over time, and why people migrate within countries and between countries. To understand migration within countries from rural to urban areas, there are the internal migration theories. Migrate from one country to the other, international migration theories. And just before that, also showing some terms, some concepts that are important in migration. And here is just a series of diagrams that I got from this website to give an overview of what theory is, what our studies, our scientific studies try to do when we answer research questions. So overall, what we usually have is we saw previous countries that experienced decline in mortality, decline in fertility, and we have an idea of what are the reasons of why mortality and fertility decline. That previous knowledge done by other researchers, other demographers, sociologists, and so on, these studies were already based on data, and they already tested their hypothesis, and they came up with some conclusions. All these previous studies, they help us understand what's going on now and what might happen in the future. So when you have all these studies that already try to understand a specific topic, and I will try to use those studies maybe to focus in a country that's less studied, or maybe I want to understand the country where I live right now that already analyzed before, but I want to know what's going to work from now, it's going to happen from now on. I use these previous theories to understand where I'm going to study now. So if I have previous studies that were done about a topic, and I can use those previous studies to kind of like say, oh, I have an idea of why this is going on, I can use those theories, those studies as my theoretical framework. Those previous studies, that theoretical framework, help me answer my research question before I look at the data. The preliminary answer to my research question before I look at the data, and this preliminary answer is based on the theory, is called hypothesis. So the hypothesis, the preliminary answer to my research question before I look at the data, and it's based on previous studies, right? Why there is, what are the causes of poverty? What are the causes of people having lower earnings? Previous studies show education. Previous studies say different experience by race, ethnicity. Previous studies say gender inequality. Previous studies say marital status. Usually married people have higher earnings. Previous studies say a lot of stuff. So I use that knowledge to say, oh, okay, I have so much income inequality in the country because of all these factors. This is my preliminary answer before I look at the data. Are these preliminary answers to my research question correct? I have to test. I have to test the hypothesis, right? To test the hypothesis, what do I have to do? I have to collect data about my population. I have to collect data with questionnaires or interviews and so on, and collecting data is what's called here observation. I'm observing my population, I'm collecting data. If I don't have money to collect data, but I can access data from other sources, from the Census Bureau, for example, right? When I collect data by myself, that's a primary data collection. When I analyze data from other institutions or from other researchers, I'm using secondary data, right? So with the data collected, what can I do? I can test the hypothesis. I can test if those preliminary answers to my research question, which were based in my theory, are correct. If they are correct, I confirm the hypothesis, and that makes my theory stronger, right? The opposite can happen, yes. Maybe for specific counts in specific years, some of those factors that increase income inequality are not so important anymore. So some of my hypotheses can be corroborated and others might not. Some could be validated and others might not. But whenever I find results that are completely different from what other researchers found, I have to be careful. I have to do different tests. I have to implement different analyses. Because whenever I go against previous knowledge, and I will be saying, oh, this theory is not explaining the current condition in this specific country, I have to be careful about that. So that's why science moves slow. We have to be careful whenever I'm making these major statements, right? Let's say that I'm doing a study in which I don't have, not that many people study that topic before. Let's say the research project that I just mentioned to you guys. The restaurant industry, how that was affected by the pandemic. Knowing that workers who in the restaurant industry in the back of the house tend to be more foreign born, in front of the house, US born. And during the pandemic, you have a decline in immigration to the country. And then you had a government who was against immigration. So you have so many things going on. And there are no studies that were done before about the restaurant industry, breaking it down, the workers by nativity, either US born or foreign born. In the context of a pandemic, in the context of national policies related to immigration. So it's so many different possibilities that were not analyzed before. Okay, there are some studies that analyze how public health might affect employment and this kind of stuff. So some of that I have. So some of that I can follow the same aspect here, previous studies helping me. But some of those questions that I have are new because of the new context, and not other studies analyzed it. So I have to do the other way around. I look at the data. I look at the data and see the trends in employment among foreign born, among US born, in back, in front of the house, in restaurants. I look at the data. And then, do I see any patterns in this variation in employment? And then I say, why we see more US born getting out of the restaurant industry? Oh, maybe because the US born population is more likely to get unemployment benefit from the government. And the restaurant industry, the earnings are so low that they prefer to get unemployment benefit, get out, go to another occupation or get out, don't look for jobs anymore. And the foreign born stay because the foreign born is less likely to get unemployment benefits. So I'm trying to have some tentative answers to why I see those patterns, my tentative hypothesis. And after I keep analyzing the data for other years, breaking it down, different techniques, I might come up with a strong explanation, and that helps the elaboration of a theory, of a theoretical background. And then the theory will help other further observations. So studies that usually are based on already previous knowledge, theories that help them have preliminary answers, the hypothesis, collect data and find and confirm the hypothesis or not, these are deductive studies or deduction. I start from previous knowledge and this general knowledge and analyze this particular issue here. Induction or inductive studies, I do the opposite. I go from a particular case in which I don't have much knowledge, and then I try to come up with these general explanations about that case, right? I go from the particular case and try to create a theory. And these other diagrams go in the same way, right? Deductive goes from the general to the special case, inductive from the special to the general. Deductive versus inductive. Usually deductive, usually is more quantitative approach. Inductive, qualitative approach. And this idea here of going from theory to hypothesis and then analyze data is the deductive, as we saw here. The one that we first look at the data, start to make some generalizations to get into the theory is the inductive approach, okay? So having that into mind, what is theory, hypothesis, and then I can go in different ways to do my analysis is important from now on to understand the subject of this chapter, okay? So the quiz is open now on Canvas, and it's going to be open until tomorrow at 8 p.m. And it's going to be about the world population changes over time. One question about that, and one question about US population changes over time, this chapter that we just finished, okay? Thank you very much. Have a great weekend. I see you guys on Tuesday. Thank you.